Something weird has been going on in the discussion of games over the last few years. It seems to be just becoming more and more of a thing as we get access to more data, and it massively plays into the perception of, oh, dead game, not worth bothering with. As an example, we saw this headline appear. BattleBit Steam numbers drop by 90% as new map hopes to fix that. Now, this is a headline that I think they got a bit called out for because they did end up changing it. But I'm sure you've seen the headline around, right? Game loses X% of player base. And it is true that seems like a really alarming thing, right? I mean, a successful game has lots of players, so it does follow that if less players are playing a game concurrently, your game is not as healthy. This is particularly something for like massive indie titles or multiplayer games, where almost as soon as the initial hype of a title clears or the first update fails to make it larger somehow or be particularly humongous, all the calls of dead game begin, right? And the thing is, if you feel that natural decrease in buzz and you go to Steam charts, you're going to see less players. And all these things combined means that narrativizing the death of a game does become easier and easier and easier. It's just naturally fantastic storytelling. To take a look at some familiar titles, right? Vampire Survivors, 8,000 people playing the game recently, 11,500, but a 77,000 player all-time peak. Valheim, a all-time peak of 500,000 players, but only 13,000 people playing recently, and a 32,000 player 24-hour peak. And then the thing that sparked off today's video, BattleBit, with 5,000 people playing at the time of our screenshot, a 12,000 peak, and an 86,000 player all-time peak, allowing, of course, for that 90% drop headline that initially appeared from PC Games End that had us thinking, oh, BattleBit, dead game? Really? No, obviously not. And that's because a 90% drop from an initial hype cycle for any of these games is actually a really healthy number of players that a lot of developers would absolutely kill to get. I mean, for BattleBit, its concurrent numbers can actually, compete with some Battlefield titles, which is insane for a team of that size. 12,000 players concurrent, even 5,000, 10,000 is a absolutely humongous achievement. And I'm sure you've heard of a saying called what gets measured gets managed, right? It's kind of about what analytics do you track in a company? And it is a lot like that with games where the numbers that we have are the numbers that we'll use. That's the kind of thing that we'll start listening to, and that'll inform how all these narratives form. And as Morgan Park of PC Gamer says, player count used to be a mundane stat in server browsers. Now it's the primary metric for a successful game in the eyes of its creators and especially its fans. And if you'd like to help some of our numbers, well, you can pick up the game that we developed, The Pale Beyond, on Steam and now also on the Nintendo Switch if you want a narrative adventure role-playing game. Some grim Antarctic narrative survival stuff going on. So you can check out the Steam link down below or, of course, the eShop. Now, to get into why these numbers are important, a lot of this is the industry's fault, right? Over 30 million players touts Sea of Thieves in a recent E3 trailer. Join 10 million players, says Naraka Bladepoint's trailer, right? And of course that means you'd be forgiven for thinking that 30 million people are just playing Sea of Thieves. Of course, what Rare is saying that throughout its lifetime, 30 million accounts have played the game for a period of time ever. I played Sea of Thieves for 25 minutes a few years ago. I still count in that number. So really, this is just a marketing statement. It's saying, Sea of Thieves, 30 million people have played it, and you're not one of them. Right, that's meant to get people in. So marketing gets these humongous numbers put into our brains, right, all of the time. And negative numbers, well, they're not really talked about by companies unless they basically have to because of some sort of disclosure to investors in a financial statement. So we end up in a situation then with an audience that has been trained by your marketing to believe that your game is popular and played constantly, right? And Call of Duty actually serves as a perfect example of that. And it's the sort of thing that you've really got to be aware of when you're just consuming information. So in April, Activision disclosed to investors that while Call of Duty as a whole draws in over 100 million users each and every month, actually it lost 50 million users over 2021, right? That's a fun way that numbers can be sliced. So, when an audience has been trained by your marketing to believe that your game is popular and played constantly, well, it doesn't suit your corporate interests to change that narrative at all. And that basically means that information that is shared often has got to kind of change its format, right? You've got to be a bit funny with the numbers in order to avoid real analysis happening, like with that Call of Duty situation. And one of the biggest games the last while is a good example here. So at the height of Fortnite's popularity in 2018, Epic shared that it reached over 78 million players in a single month. At some point after that, Epic stopped getting specific and started sharing lifetime player milestones like everyone else. You then think, oh, okay, why are we changing the number that we're talking about? I mean, hey, World of Warcraft is one of the best examples. They used to report subscriber numbers, and when that sort of started not really being a good number, away that number went, and we never really found out about it. And that thing with Fortnite is actually why Epic suddenly deciding to reveal player count numbers for individual modes was so intriguing, because actually it's kind of counter to their interests. Giving us that data is, in a way, not ideal, because it means we can track and narrativize a game naturally having a bit of a decline after a very, very large high. And I think a great example of that is sales numbers. I mean, globally, UK physical boxed sales end up being a talked about metric purely because even though it's not the best metric ever, it's one of the few ones that we actually have, right? And that's really the point. In a sort of void of information, we basically have just got to work off what we've got, because data is data. So then how often do you end up using, say, Twitch views to chart a game's success or failure? And of course with Steam, player counts, which of course is an interesting thing. Valve of course launched Steam Charts, which is their section of Steam that's dedicated to showing the most played and top selling games on Steam. And that's why we end up now talking about concurrent and peak numbers. This is something that, yes, we do use. Many others also use it in our attempt to divine how well a game is or is not doing. And I mean, that's fair enough. You're trying to work out how a game is performing in reality. You've got to go off the only data that you have. And of course, it helps that Steam is the largest platform on PC and that it does have that very, very, very nice data that it provides. But as an example, there are interesting caveats, and that's where I go back to Morgan Park's article. When New World released, servers were crammed as tens of thousands had to wait in line to play. A week after launch, New World made headlines when it peaked at over 900,000 concurrent players, the high point of any new game in 2021. Now, you may be thinking, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember how large those New World numbers were. And with New World, it's fairly simple. Queue times essentially meant that so many people just had the EXE open trying to connect to the game. So the overall, sort of player interest for any given 24-hour period was disproportionately concurrently online, even though of the people that were concurrently online, only a far smaller number were actually playing the game. But of course, that ends up being forgotten, right? We say, oh, New World has fallen from its peak of 900,000 concurrent players, but the actual number of players who are in servers playing New World, that absolutely was nowhere near 900,000 at that time. And to see a very different game cutting at this, I liked Evan Laddie's tweet. I remember this last year. Wow, Elden Ring has lost 50% of its players in just 1 month. Rough launch, not enough content, silence from the developer, and no roadmap or battle pass in sight. Dead game. Now, of course, for a game like that, I mean, being near 500,000 after a month is basically completely insane. But here's the thing, by the standards that we talk about, say, New World, BattleBit, Valheim, yeah, if we're going to say 90% for them, and you're sort of applying the same methodology, then yeah, technically Elden Ring lost 50% of its players in a month. Which, when you think about it in the context of a game that broadly has a positive story, you kind of start to realize, hang on a second, maybe this methodology is not exactly right. But again, data's just data. It can be used to essentially legitimize any narrative in a way where you do feel very grounded and backed up. And that's actually where it presents a bit of a problem for some game developers. So, BattleBit Remastered, it's a game that I think is awesome. Broadly, people are extremely happy about it. If somebody was to be interested in BattleBit, though, and they saw the original version, of course, of this article from PC Games N, that it has dropped by 90% and a new map is hoping to fix that, which is framing that a map being launched is a response to the 90% player decline, that might make someone feel like, oh, BattleBit? I don't want to play that. That's evidently a dead or dying game. It'll be like Lawbreakers in a month. It kind of reinforces a bit of a strange false narrative when, of course, the reality is this game had headlines absolutely everywhere, and now all that's happened is it's returned to basically a normal, healthy, sustainable number of players. There's another fact, too. If we're just managing concurrent players, here's the deal. Someone might have went from playing BattleBit 4, 5, 6 nights a week when the game was brand new. Maybe now they're only playing it 1 or 2 nights a week because there's other games that they're interested in. That is a totally normal thing to happen a month or two after a game comes out, and that essentially means that a player could still be interested in BattleBit, still be playing BattleBit fairly regularly, but because they're not playing it as intensely and in as clustered, of a play pattern, because big game, you're going to play it a whole bunch of nights in a row, that just disproportionately hurts a game that in reality is really, really healthy. Far more healthy than really any indie shooter can expect to reasonably be, right? And that's kind of the crazy thing when we so much are having to talk about, like, concurrent players. Plus, it's not all Steam. As an example, Turtle Rock probably wouldn't have loved those articles about Left 4 Dead 2 having more Steam players than Back 4 Blood. But of course, Back 4 Blood is a new game on other major platforms. And of course, one of those platforms is Xbox Game Pass, right? Even to take Halo Infinite, it obviously is not humongous on Steam, yet it will, of course, have its Xbox player base as well. Ultimately, then, this is leading us into quite a strange mindset. As Morgan Park points out in his article, when you're told that 30 million people have played Sea of Thieves, I mean, what are you really going to do with that information? What does it really mean in a way that's relevant to what happens if you try to boot up the game and play it right now? In reality, it's just a marketing beat that is saying, hey, the in-group's really big and you're not in it because you've not played the game yet. As for Steam charts, then, it is actually genuinely very useful. I mean, if you've got a multiplayer game that is primarily on Steam and it has maybe 60 average players, yeah, that's going to be a really important signal that even if that's a really good game, you may not have, the ability to actually access the experience that you're sort of paying for, in a reasonable fashion, right? Because perhaps you cannot find a lobby or something like that. So that's one really useful example. Another really useful example is it does help us know how big a game's launch is, because during a launch, people have only just bought the game and yeah, they'll be highly likely to play it. So there's like a very strong correlation between games' overall initial performance in terms of sales and what it's going to say on Steam. As an example, like if you go to say, like our game, The Pale Beyond, being a indie title that is a, that's like a narrative game that is single player, that's also not a like 200-hour RPG like Baldur's Gate, there could be like 15 people playing it on Steam. And you might think, wow, dead game, 0 sales. When I can say like, no, that game has more than made its budget back. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we're swimming in beans. It's not been some insane runaway success, but it has been overall a fairly high percentile success. Certainly, if it was a multiplayer game, maybe we'd be having a different discussion, but at the end of the day, that's why, as an indie, I wouldn't really be going to make some sort of multiplayer game that would, require that, like, really large amount of players, that sort of critical mass. And I bring that up to say that concurrence on launch is something that is fairly decently correlated with a game's initial launch sales, right? Because in that period of time, people will be buying a game with a fairly high intent to play. But unless you're talking about a multiplayer title that requires loads of people to be online for you to actually get a game experience, the correlation between a game's overall success in the market and its concurrent players, or maybe even its average players, those diverge so rapidly after launch that to essentially say, oh, this game is down by like 90% in 2 months, in a way, it's not actually a particularly fair methodology, because that success to player count number, highly correlated at the start, less correlated at the end. Again, assuming that we're not talking about a multiplayer game where you're barely struggling to find servers. Whereas, of course, with BattleBit and its 5,500 people concurrently playing, 12,500, 24-hour peak, you're absolutely easily going to find a server, which does mean that the health of the game is extremely strong in a way that a headline like that would really just sort of mislead someone away from, right? And maybe mean that they're not going to support that game, that they're not going to purchase that game, because ultimately we're all trying to be rational and we don't want to invest our time in something that we feel isn't going to be able to go the distance. And so this leads to the dead game discourse, right? Where people think, oh, dead game. And what does that conjure up? It conjures up the image of a server browser with loads and loads of empty servers where you're basically unable to have, a good gameplay experience. In reality, multiplayer games can often get by on fewer concurrent players than you may think. Sometimes, right? A game is not designed to be a forever live service, and it can just be done and a little bit through with its normal, natural life cycle in such a way that, yeah, maybe in a year can go on sale and loads of people can pick it up and play it. And that'll be totally fine, even though the Steam numbers may not necessarily show that, that there is some sort of large success. I mean, there's been a few times with Pale where it's been on sale, people have picked our game up, some of them have played it, some of them haven't yet, but they wanted to pick it up during the sale. So you could look at, say, a Steam concurrent player number and think, oh, wow, I mean, you must have sold 50 copies. When in reality, no, it's actually, we sold 1,500 or 2,000 copies during this sale period. It's just an interesting thing. Once you actually have access to the back-end Steam data of sales and the things that are more correlated to a game's actual performance, you do just start to have this more real appreciation of how these player numbers do and don't correlate. I mean, as an example, The Hunt. The Hunt is a really, really successful game, right? Here we can see 38,000 players all-time peak, 28,000 players, 24-hour peak. I just want to say that's insane, right? That that game has been able to just truck along relatively healthy. And from what we understand, it is a game that's just trucked on relatively healthy, where everyone's absolutely happy. Yeah, it's probably not doing Naraka Blade Point numbers. It's not doing PUBG numbers. People may think, oh, Hunt, dead game. Look at that, 7,000 players playing it. That's a small number compared to the other games. It's 50%, 90% smaller than this game number, even though this is a game where you will have a great experience, reliably find servers, and, see updates and stuff. So again, dead game. I mean, look at this. Hunt Showdown, discussion. Why is this game dead? I have to say, it's a really good game, but why are so few people playing? And if you look at this, 16th of July, 2021, look at where that number is. That is actually a really healthy game with loads of people who are playing it. That is basically the situation. I think I wanted to talk about this really for the same reasons that Morgan Park did in that article a while back, specifically because before they changed their title, we saw it, and we kind of had this script already in the works where we were kind of frustrated with how some of the discourse was going. So as soon as I saw that, I thought, okay, we have got to resurrect that, and we need to talk about this issue, because if that is the perception that BattleBit is getting, it is just really unfair. I'm glad that they've seemingly acknowledged that and changed their headline. I'm glad that we grabbed it though when it was up. I'd love to know, what are your thoughts on this? And for you, what are games that you play that have a smaller number of concurrents? As an example, I used to play a source mod called Resistance and Liberation. It was a really, really fun World War II shooter. And you would have sworn there was it was a dead game and nobody played it, There might only be one or two, maybe 250 people online. But what that actually meant is, for a good few months, way after it came out, I could just go and play a game. Because even though it was 250 people who were online concurrently, that was more than enough to fill up servers so that I could have plenty of gameplay options, right? So, worth keeping in mind, I suppose, as we consume the delicious media diet that's offered up to us. That's it for me then. If you want to support what we're doing, of course, you can check out The Pale Beyond on Steam and now on the Nintendo Switch eShop. Cheers, and I'll see you later.